Hi there everybody, welcome back to another YouTube tutorial. In this video, we're going to be reviewing how to assemble our Feral Style Puffy Handpaw pattern with an optional dew claw. If you're interested in this pattern, make sure to check out our Etsy. There's going to be a link in the description that'll take you directly to the listing where you can buy this pattern for yourself and then follow along as we make it. If you do like our patterns, the best way to support us is through our Patreon. From workshop updates to monthly patterns delivered straight to your inbox, we even have a class that we host every single month to teach you guys special skills about how to make fursuits. If you like watching our stuff on YouTube, you'll love watching us make fursuits live. We go live pretty regularly on TikTok, Twitch, and even right here on YouTube. There's going to be links to all of those platforms in the description where you can go and check us out on there and get notified when we go live. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this video. If you have fun, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and even hit that little notification bell so that you can know when we post new videos or when we live stream. And without further ado, let's get into the video. The first material that you're going to need is a faux fur and a toe bean material of your choice. We're also going to need to pick up a lycra or a stretch material for your liner, as well as thread that closely matches your fur color. We're also going to need some polyfill stuffing, as well as some hot glue sticks. For tools, we recommend a silver Sharpie to trace on your fabric, as well as a very sharp pair of scissors for cutting fabric. We're gonna recommend that you use a sewing machine, but if you want to, you can definitely hand sew this. Grab some wonder clips, as well as some sewing pins for the applique stage. And finally, the last tool you need is a pet slicker brush. Our very first step in our process is going to be cutting out all of the pattern pieces that we intend to use. We like using a decently sharp pair of scissors for this and going around the outside edges of our black line. If you intend to utilize the optional dew claw add-on in this pattern, you'd want to cut that out too. At this point, go ahead and grab our back of the hand and liner patterns and tape those together. Once you've done that, go ahead and grab our front of the hand pattern as well as the finger patterns, and with those you're going to use an X-Acto knife to cut out those little beans. This is going to help us out later when we get to the applique stage. If you intend to use this pattern more than once, we highly recommend laminating it. It's going to make your pattern way easier to trace on the fabric, as well as improve its longevity. The first thing that we want to do whenever we're tracing out pattern pieces onto fur is determine the fur direction. Maintaining a proper fur direction is imperative to making sure our pattern turns out like it's intended to. clip, you'll see us tracing out the palm portions. Make sure when you're tracing out the palms or the fingers, you're going to be tracing out that inner toe bean portion as well. Don't worry about cutting that toe bean out though. This is just a guide for our applique step later on. As you'll notice, we're tracing two of these palm pieces, one with the text up and one with the text down. This is a process called reflecting. The pieces traced with the text up on the patterns, I'll always put an X on them. This will help us later, particularly when it comes to attaching the fingers. We're also going to cut out two of those front of the hand pieces. These are going to function as our wrists later on. Last pieces we're going to trace out on this fabric are going to be our back of the hand pieces. You'll want to trace two of these as well. Next, we're going to grab the fur that we intend to use for our toes. Just like with the other fabric, our first thing that we're going to do is double check that fur direction. We're going to start by tracing the backs of the fingers. There's a few key things to pay attention to when we're tracing out these fingers. You'll notice in this video, we're making tiny little dashes. Those dashes are going to match up to the little red dashes that are already on the fingers. Those dashes are specifically for aligning our claws in the later steps. So if you're choosing not to make claws, no need to add those. If you choose to make this pattern without the dew claw, you're going to have a grand total of 8 fingers. You're going to have 4 inners and 4 outers. If you do want to choose to make the dew claws, you're going to have a total of 10 fingers, 4 inners, 4 outers, and 2 dew claws. In this clip, you see us tracing out the inner fingers. You'll notice that we've reflected the inner finger. We've traced 2 of the inner fingers with the text up and added the X to them, and 2 of the inner fingers with the text down and didn't add the X to them. You'll also notice that we added an I to all of the inner fingers, and we'll add an O to all of the outer fingers. This will help determine the position of them later on. We're now moving on to trace 4 of those outer fingers. 2 of them are going to have the text up with the X's, and 2 of them will have the text down with no X's. You're now going to trace the front of the fingers in the exact same way that we trace the back of them. We're going to have 4 of the inners and 4 of the outers, all properly marked, and making sure that we're also tracing that toe bean so we can applique it later. At this point, if you are choosing to do those dew claws, this is your moment. Go ahead and trace 2 of the back of fingers of the dew claws, as well as 2 of the front of fingers, making sure that we're reflecting them as well. Now we finally get to cut everything out. Cutting out fur is tricky, especially if you've never done it before, so you definitely want to take your time with this. When you're cutting out fur, you want to take small snips with a small, sharp pair of scissors, making sure that your bottom blade underneath the fabric is butting up right up against the backing of your fabric, rather than the fur itself. It's at this point that you could choose to utilize seam allowance if you'd like. A lot of people like to utilize seam allowance and will add anywhere from 3 millimeters to 1/4 of an inch. If you'd like to utilize seam allowance, you're more than welcome to, but in this example, we aren't using any. Now we're starting to get into the tricky stuff. Our next step is applique. You want to take each individual piece that we intend to applique, which are all of our fingers and our palm pad, and cut out squares of minky around them that are roughly the same size and shape, as well as going in the same direction as the fur. Our next step is going to be taking those little sewing pins and pinning on our minky or whatever paw pad material that you've chosen onto the pieces that we intend to applique. Our goal is to take our paw pad material and to make it as flat as humanly possible to negate any sort of wrinkling that we may have when we sew it down. This very well may take you a few tries. It's really tough, especially if it's your first time doing it, so definitely be patient with yourself. Now we get to sew. I like to trace out our applique around the back with a straight stitch, following those lines that we created earlier, and taking out the pins as I go. A lot of people will choose to just sew right over those pins, but I've snapped a few needles doing that, so I prefer to take them out. If you've done the previous step correctly, your paw pads should come out something similar to this. Our next step is to go ahead and trim out those paw pads from the excess minky. I like using a pair of what are called applique scissors and making sure that we're trimming nice and snug up to that stitch line. The value of these type of scissors is that their bottom blade is a little bit wider, and so it's going to prevent you from trimming too close to that seam that we just stitched. The last thing we want is to accidentally snip one of the stitches that we just laid down and have all of our hard work unravel on us. Once you get all of that excess minky trimmed out of the way, the next thing that we're going to want to do is brush out any trapped fur fibers from underneath our stitching. Rather than brushing out all of the trapped fur, you may actually choose to leave some to assist that fur in properly framing your paw pad. I like to then go in and trim out any extra trapped fur to ensure that it doesn't come out later and mess up the framing that I've created. At this point, we're going to bring our paw pad back over to the sewing machine and stitch around the outside with a zigzag stitch. This is really going to help make sure that our stitching is secure and isn't going to unravel later. At this point, you could even choose to add a little extra texture to your paw pads by adding a few additional lines and sewing over them with a straight stitch. Once sewn and stuffed, it gives a really cute three-dimensional look. Once you've finished appliquing the palms, you're going to move on to the fingers, and we're going to do these in the same exact way that we did for the palms. When you're doing the stitching for these paw pads, you want to make double sure that both your upper thread and your bobbin thread match the color of the paw pad material. This will really help ensure that we're able to hide our stitches. After sewing 10 of those fingers and 2 of those palms, you very well may have come to the same conclusion that we have. Boy, does that take a lot of time. Here in the Spilt Grape Soda office, we don't actually do our applique by hand anymore. We have an embroidery machine that's called a FAF Creative Icon that we have programmed to do all of these simple tasks for us. Please enjoy these very satisfying clips of our embroidery machine sewing out a couple of palm pads for us. If you're adding claws to these hand paws, tune in, now's your moment. If not, feel free to skip ahead a bit. Select any claw that you'd like from our Pado claws that came with our pattern and cut it out. If you're also doing the dew claw option, you're going to also select the matching claw shape from our dew claw palette. Take those claws and trace out 8 of the full-size one and then 2 of the miniature claws if you are choosing to add dew claws to your project. When we trace our claws, we like to double up our minky rather than just cutting out 2 claws of every shape. This helps us ensure that all of the claws are going to have the minky going in that same direction and be way easier to sew. Take your claws over to the sewing machine and using a straight stitch, sew around each one of the claws, making sure to leave that bottom open so that way we can flip it right side out and stuff it later on. Be sure to take your time with these. Getting around those curvatures and making sure that each claw is the same is going to be really important when it comes to overall project symmetry in the long run. As you may have already guessed, we have our embroidery machine set up to sew our claws as well. When you're cutting out those claws, be sure to give those stitches plenty of leeway. We don't want to accidentally cut a stitch and cause all of our hard work to unravel, nor do we want to cut so close to them that our fabric actually unravels and then lets our stitches loose. Our next step is going to be flipping all of those claws right side out and then stuffing them to our desired density. This is really a personal preference. Do whatever feels best to you. Once they are stuffed, you're going to go ahead and sew those babies shut. Because claws are so small and the materials that they're made out of are often so slippery, we really recommend that you hand sew these claws shut. If you're feeling confident, you are more than welcome to try to give them a go on machine and sew them shut over there. Once all the claws are sewn up, you're going to go ahead and get ready to sew them into the fingers. Lines that we made earlier on these fingers are going to help you align the claws symmetrically across your whole project. For this set, we're choosing to align the bottom of our claw with that claw mark, but it really doesn't matter what you choose to do, so long as all of the claws are aligned in the same way. From here, you're going to then sew all of the claws into the fingers. If you're feeling confident on your sewing machine, you can definitely utilize your sewing machine to sew these claws in, but I would recommend for those of us that are a little newer at fursuit making to go ahead and hand sew all of these claws in with a blanket stitch. If you aren't installing claws, you have it much easier. Just clip up the darts like we're showing in this video here and sew them shut. At this point, our hand paw is really starting to look like a hand paw. At this point, we're going to start attaching all of our little finger backings to the back of the hand portion that we cut out earlier. It's at this point in the process that those X's that we traced on earlier become really important. You'll notice that even though we have inner and outer fingers, the X versions of those fingers will remain on the same side, whereas the non-X will be on the opposite side. Once you get a few of those fingers clipped on, take it over to your sewing machine and sew them on with a straight stitch. You'll note that at this point I have only sewn on alternating fingers. Choosing to alternate the fingers like this makes sewing them so much easier. At this point, we're going to attach that front of the hand wrist portion to that palm portion, also with a straight stitch. Again, all of your pieces marked with an X are going to be on one side of your paw, whereas the pieces marked without the X are going to be on the other side of your paw. This goes for our dew claw as well. When we finish making these hand paws, we want to make sure that our dew claw is both on the left side of one hand paw and the right side of another hand paw. That little dew claw finger, if you're adding it, is going to be the only thing about this pattern that will be asymmetrical. It's finally time to clip the front of the hand paw to the back of the hand paw. This is where our wonder clips come in super handy. Before we start clipping all the way around, we like to go through and add anchor points. Our anchor points are going to be where for sure we know pieces are supposed to line up. For instance, we know for sure that our claws are going to want to face forward. Because of that, we ensure that we're clipping our darts in at the forward-most pointing part of our fingers. Once we have those anchors in, then we get to fill up every space in between. There is no such thing as too many wonder clips here. Go crazy, fur is incredibly slippery. You want to make sure that your wonder clips have the best hold on your project that you can to make it easier for you to sew. Now we get to attach those two sides together. I like using a straight stitch for this and going real slow here. This is tough. Again, fur is slippery. You want to make sure it doesn't get away from you, and so really taking your time here is super important. If you don't feel confident enough on your sewing machine to do this, don't even worry about it. You can absolutely do this by hand with a blanket stitch. It'll just take a little bit longer. Once you've successfully sewn the back and the front of those hand paws together, now it's time to stuff. I like making teeny little cuts in the middle of the paw pads and adding the proper amount of stuffing. You want to make sure that you add enough to fully fill out the paw pads, but not so much that you are pulling that fabric and causing any wrinkles. Once those paw pads are stuffed, you can either choose to go back in and sew up those little holes that you created or leave them be. Moving on to our liner, we're going to prep this in a very similar way to how we prepped our claws. We're going to trace the amount we need, which is 2, and then we're also going to double up that fabric, so that way we don't have to worry about tracing and cutting out and sewing very slippery, tricky pieces. Just like we've done for just about everything so far, we're going to go ahead and trace over those lines that we put down with a straight stitch on our machine. Because we've doubled up that fabric, the last thing that we have to do is cut around those lines that we just traced out, making sure to leave enough room to not snip our stitches. Once you've cut it all out, we're going to take it over to our hand paw and clip on our liner to our sewn up hand paw. All we need to do to attach the liner is sew up the edges with that straight stitch and then add a couple of anchor stitches right on the tips of the fingers. There's really no need to sew all the way around the liner, as our goal is to simply anchor it in place. Once the liner is attached to our hand paw fabric, you get to enjoy arguably the worst part about fursuit making, which is turning these hand paws right side out. There is no secret, easy way to do this. Regardless of how you do it, it's going to suck. The best tip we can give you is to use a Sharpie marker or something similar to help jam the fingers through. Our next step is going to be adding stuffing to the backs of the fingers. You're going to stuff between the liner and that upper piece of fur. We're making sure that we're not stuffing inside of the liner because we don't want to touch the stuffing later. Our only goal with stuffing these backs of the fingers is to make sure that the fingers are able to hold their shape. I like to add a dense bit of stuffing at the very tips of the fingers and then significantly less stuffing towards the back. If you add too much stuffing to the fingers, it's going to significantly reduce the amount of dexterity that you have. If you don't add enough, the fingers won't hold their shape. Finding a balance between these two things is really important, which is why I recommend that you're trying on this hand paw as you stuff it. For adding the cuff, you're going to take a measurement across the bottom of your hand paw and double it. You can choose to utilize minky or bias tape for your cuffs, really whatever suits your fancy. We aren't going to go too into depth on how exactly we do our cuffs in this video, because there is so much information out there on YouTube on how other people add cuffs to stuff. If you're interested in learning the exact way that we like to add cuffs to our pieces, go ahead and hop on over to our Etsy. There's going to be a link in the description, and you can purchase our deluxe cuff tutorial for just $5 that'll tell you exactly how we do our cuffs for fursuit parts. Once you've added your cuffs, you'll be able to go through and do all of the fancy little detail work, trimming any loose threads, making sure all the seams look good, and once you do that, your hand paws should be done. And with that, boom, pow, YouTube magic, 2 hand paws. Look at those. Those look fantastic. They look fantastic on Lauren. I can only assume they also look fantastic on you. You did a great job. Hey! Thank you so much for watching our YouTube video. We hope you had just as much fun watching it as we had making it. We wanted to give a particular shout out to those on our Fursuit University tier on Patreon. Those names are going to be Amy L, Slumber Yote, Chris, Willow, Toy Carnival Creations, Goober the Burger, Trost, Mariana E, Rapid Sparks, The Brandix, Bark Roast, Freckled Cat, Marcus D, Skiggles, Meyer, Ratkip, and Makai. Thank you so much for your superb support. We couldn't do what we do without people like you. If you guys wanted to check out our Patreon, hop on over to patreon.com and look up Spilt Grape Soda. You could join our monthly fursuit classes that we host, or you could even get on our pattern tier and get a pattern delivered straight to your inbox every single month. If you're interested in that, or even any of the other patterns we've released in the past, or any of the other crazy kind of fursuit building stuff that we have, hop on over to our Etsy. You can find us at spiltgrapesoda.etsy.com. And with that, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next video. Bye! Hey! Thank you so much for watching our YouTube video. We have so much shorter than you. So much shorter than you.